Hope everybody's doing well this morning. Good for you. Hello. Hope everything's going good for you this morning. We are in the book of Matthew. You can meet me in Matthew chapter 19. That's where we'll be studying today. As a matter of fact, as you came in at all the entrances, there were handouts, and this is where we're at this morning. We have spent the last 3 weeks in the book of Matthew marching our way into Galilee. And now this Sunday morning, we are ready to leave Galilee, and we're at an interesting time, an interesting period where Jesus is teaching some things that are going on, and we're really going to be able to slow down this morning, talk about a couple of things that are taking place inside of Matthew chapter 19, down through Matthew chapter 21, and see some things that will help us as we think about our lives, because we have been looking at this study in the book of Matthew with one lens in focus. We've been looking at this study in the idea of the king and his kingdom. And we have seen John forerun Jesus and talk about how the kingdom of heaven was at hand and how men and women must repent. We've seen Jesus enter the world. We've seen Jesus begin his ministry with those same words, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And we've seen Jesus call his disciples. We've seen Jesus teach his disciples. But we've also seen Jesus, and we spent a lot of time the last 3 weeks looking at how Jesus interacted with the various communities of which he entered in. And we saw Jesus in every occasion reach out to those groups and be concerned about their physical condition and also being concerned about their spiritual condition. And now we find Jesus at this time as he's entered Galilee, on his way out of Galilee, at this particular area in the book of Matthew. So we will begin our particular scene by looking at where we're going to go, and here's the 4 divisions of our study together this morning. We're going to see that Jesus is teacher. Now, we've already seen Jesus teaching, but I want to specifically get into one occasion where Jesus asked a question, and you'll see that question here in just a moment, and we'll see Jesus teach. But what I want to also do as we go through this particular occasion is notice the attitude of those Jesus was teaching. Notice the attitude of those that were asking Jesus the question, and then notice the attitude of Christ and see how he interacted with them and learn some lessons there for us. Then we're going to see how Jesus had disciples, and we're going to see something that's interesting about the disciples here in this particular occasion, how they interacted with Jesus and others. And then we're going to see Jesus enter Jerusalem. This is going to be a very important time, as this is really the beginning. Jesus has said on multiple occasions, I'm going to go and be betrayed, I'm going to be killed and rise again the third day. He has over and over and over prepared his disciples for this. They yet don't see it, because it's getting closer and closer and closer. And then we're going to see Jesus being opposed again, and see Jesus as he interacts with those that opposed him. So let's start off by seeing Jesus as he's leaving Galilee being the teacher. And we start in Matthew chapter 19, verse 1. So go ahead and turn there. Matthew chapter 19. We're going to stay there for quite a while in our study this morning. And notice how Jesus interacted with people. Now, when you hear the phrase or the words Matthew 19, what comes to mind? I see people doing this. They already know. What comes to mind? Marriage, divorce, and then there's that third word, remarriage. Now, is that an important topic? 100%. Sure is. Is that a topic that needs to be taught today? 100% sure does. Now, our focus today is going to be less on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Now, don't see that as me diminishing that idea. Don't see me diminishing that we should or should not teach that, because we should. But what I want to focus in on is what Jesus does as he interacts with the people. We will talk about this idea, and we'll even reference verse 9 as you and I need to from time to time. But I want to focus on those first 6 verses as Jesus interacts with these people. And we see the continuation. And what this is the Pharisees trying to trick Jesus. That was their goal. They wanted to see Jesus stop. They wanted to see Jesus put to an end. As a matter of fact, eventually, long enough, they'll get to their goal. But we read here in Matthew chapter 19, as we start in verse 1, Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Jesus has now left Galilee. All that we have studied in the last segment, those last 3 weeks, has been Jesus entering Galilee and Jesus working among the people of Galilee and Jesus as he prepared himself to leave Galilee because it was time for him to start marching toward Jerusalem. But here's what's happening. Jesus has finished his sayings. What sayings did Jesus say? Well, you go back up to verse 35 of Matthew chapter 18 and you read this. So my heavenly Father also will do if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. The last chapter ended on the scenes of forgiveness. Probably a very difficult subject for us because, let me ask you this question, is it easy to forgive? And you'll remember as we ended our last class, we asked the question, how hard would it be for God to forgive the whole world? We struggle with forgiving one or two from time to time, but remember the perspective of this equation. Jesus is getting ready to what? To die for the world. Amazing in that scene. By the way, what did Jesus say on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgiveness is an impressive scene, and after all this is finished, he leaves Galilee and he comes in the region of Judea. Now, as you rolled into verse 2, I want you to see the people. This is very important for us this morning. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. This is something that we've noticed over the last about 4 or 5 weeks studying the book of Matthew, because as Jesus' ministry begins, you see his following just increase and increase and increase. Now, there's a reason behind that. Number one, who is Jesus? Why do they follow him? Who is Jesus? Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is not just mankind. Jesus is much more, let me say it this way, than you and I. And the world recognized that. And maybe what we need to do is ask ourselves the question, do we recognize how great Jesus is in comparison to you and I as individuals? But also you see the greatness Jesus saw in us in what he did. But Jesus comes, the multitudes followed him, and Jesus is at a height right here. Does that bother you? You may be thinking, well, that's a weird question to ask. Does it bother you that Jesus was popular? No, it doesn't bother us at all, does it? I mean, we are people who follow after Christ. We're people who follow after God. We are people who look after his word. We're people that are supposed to live by his word. It doesn't bother us one bit that Jesus was popular. Now, was that the entire population at the time? No. Because as we see these people that love Jesus, and as we see Jesus showing who he was, and he healed them there were also others who didn't care for Jesus. We've talked about them numerous times in our study in the book of Matthew, as talking about them as the Pharisees, the religious elite of their day, the people who thought they were the best. Come to find out they're not. And we read this in verse 3. The Pharisees also came to him. Listen to these next 2 words. Testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? What's the answer to that? Okay, now let me ask you a follow-up question. Does it matter what question the Pharisees asked Jesus, testing him? What was their purpose? Was their purpose to find out the answer? Their purpose was not to find out the answer. Now, here's a difference between Jesus and us. You think Jesus knew that he was being tested? Yeah. We see that often. We've referenced that several times in the book of Matthew where he interacted with the Pharisees about how he could see the intents of their heart. Do you and I always know when someone's asking us a question, the motive that's behind the question? Sometimes motives are pure, aren't they? We need to know the answer. But sometimes motives are evil, aren't they? Do we automatically know the difference? No. We don't, do we? That makes us different than Jesus here. Jesus knew the motive, and Jesus responded in a like-according manner. But I want to get back to this idea. Does it matter what question they asked Jesus because they were trying to trick him? It just happened to be about marriage. It just happened to be about divorce and remarriage. And it just happened to be a great time for Jesus to respond. So Jesus does respond, and he gives the answers. In Matthew 19:4, I've referenced this passage a number of times before, but Jesus asked this question. He says, "Have you not read that he which made them male and female?" What does Jesus do when he answers the questions of the Pharisees? He takes them all the way back to what we would call Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And he asks this very simple question. Have you not read? Now, a couple of things that stand out to me at least, and I think they stand out to you as well, is number one, any Bible question we have, where are the answers? Just takes a little bit of reading, doesn't it? Number two, sometimes we know the answers and we forget. Have you ever forgotten something? I can't be the only one that's done that. Have you ever forgotten something? You ever forgotten where something was? I'm talking about biblically. Sometimes that happens to us. But sometimes we forget. So what does Bible reading tell me? It's valuable. Because it reminds me of where things are and what God has said and the standard that God has put before our lives. So Jesus asked this very fundamental question, have you not read? By the way, remember the Pharisees, who were they supposed to be? They were supposed to know the law. And Jesus is going back to God's law and asking the question, have you not read? The rhetorical question is, yes, they've read. In other words, Jesus knew who they were. Jesus knew what they were doing. And Jesus gives this answer. He gives a saying in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Now, remember from verse 4, verse 5, 6, 7, and 8, Jesus interacts with them. He talks about the things that were taking place. He talks about the hardness of their heart. But remember verse 6. We'll get to verse 9 in just a minute. Remember verse 6. So then they are no longer two, but one. Is marriage permanent? Is marriage for life? Okay, I don't want anyone this morning to leave saying, Jonathan just kind of skipped over these things, but I want you to see Jesus interact with these people. Have you not read was his answer. Then he gives them the answer they needed to know, but that wasn't good enough for them. For whatever reason with the Pharisees, that wasn't good enough. Verse 7, why did Moses command a certificate of divorce to put her away? That wasn't good enough for them. And Jesus says this, and I say to you, I want you to signify in on something real quick. And I say to you, is Jesus speaking on behalf of Moses? Is Jesus speaking on behalf of the religious world of the day? Who's he speaking on behalf of? God, or, listen to this, himself. Who is Jesus? Jesus is not mere mortal alone, is he? But he was the Word, John 1:14, that became flesh. He is God in the flesh. And Jesus, as he begins this statement, as he commits himself to what's being taught here, he says, whosoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whosoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. But focus in on this. We'll get to the last part of the verse in just a moment. And I say unto you, it's obvious to me that if, I already know this is not the case, but I want you to think about this and reason with it. If they were asking to know, they could have known. They could have known for two reasons. Number one, Jesus said, have you not read? You know what that tells me? The Old Testament firms up God's view on marriage. From the beginning, God set the standard of marriage. What was the standard of marriage? One man, one woman, for how long? Life. The standard was already set. Jesus reaffirms that. But number two, if they were asking to really know, he tells them in deep explanation when they ask their rebuttal question from verse 7, what they needed to know. And I say unto you. So I want you to see this morning Jesus as teacher. But I want you to see Jesus interacting with people who hated him. Let's call the Pharisees what they are. Let's call their attitudes what they are. Let's call their actions what they are. Did the Pharisees hate Jesus? The answer is yes. Matter of fact, they wanted to put him to death. And in previous segments in the book of Matthew, they wanted to, but because of the multitudes, they feared the people. They hated Jesus. Yes?
You made the point just 2 minutes ago that he's firming up what the Old Testament says. It just hit me. That verse right there is a standout. It says, a lot of what he says is in the Sermon on the Mount, but I say,
That's right.
this is not a change.
This is a continuation, exactly. It's a continuation of everything from the Old Testament. That's a good point, the and the but there. But this is a continuation of everything that's been taught. Here's the idea. Here's the thought I want you to get with Jesus' teaching here. He's not just teaching about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, even though that's the explicit context of the segment. But what is he teaching about? Authority. Authority. Where does the standard of living come from? Does it come from the Pharisees? It does not. Does it come from Moses? It does not. Does it come from the multitudes of the world? It does not. Where does it come from? It comes from God. Jesus is teaching on authority, and he's referencing back to you and I how we can understand authority. I'm convinced of two things. Number one, I'm convinced that one of our greatest problems that will happen in the future will come from our lack of understanding of biblical authority. What I mean by that is we'll find ways to do what we want to and then we'll justify it. And here's number two. The answers have always been there. This question was not new. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about Moses, because did Moses ever have to deal with the problems of the hearts of mankind? Did God ever have to deal with the problems of the hearts of mankind? The answer is yes. This problem isn't new. And whatever problem it might have been, whatever question they could have asked him, this is a question about authority. And the bulk of the teaching here, in my opinion, you and I need to pay attention to authority. How do we establish the standard on marriage? Authority. Not yours or mine, not our wishes, but authority that only comes from God. And in this scene, Jesus gives this illustration of what's taking place and what needs to happen. And I say to you. Now, interestingly enough, I want you to see something, verse 10. His disciples said unto him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. You ever misunderstood what somebody said? The disciples missed it here, okay? You know what they were saying? Marriage sounds too hard. If that's the case, it's best for man not to marry. Well, what was the case? One man, one woman for how long? Life. Now let me ask you this question. Men, don't answer. Is marriage hard? Yes. It is. Can marriage be complicated? Can we get ourselves in what I like to call a pickle? Men, you answer this quietly to yourself. You ever got in trouble with your wife? Wives, answer this quietly to yourself. You ever got in trouble with your husband? And based on the smiles and smirks and giggles, we've all been there. Marriage is difficult. And therefore they thought, inside of verse 10, if this is the case, let's just not get married. Man shouldn't be married. If it's going to be that hard, let's just not get married. Now, is Matthew 19 the only occasion where we read about marriage inside the Scriptures? It's not. And therefore, there are a lot of places we need to go to talk about marriage. But remember what's happening here in Matthew 19. This is a segment that is talking about authority. There was a question posed. Jesus showed where to find the authority. There was a rebuttal question. Jesus brought them back to authority. And by the way, the Pharisees never said anything else. Notice that. I think that's important. But the disciples said, boy, that's got to be hard. Let's just not get married. And then they go on. And Jesus says inside of verse 11, all cannot accept this saying, but only to those who has been given. He says there are, In verse 12, there are eunuchs who were born for thus their mother's wombs, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Here's the truth. Marriage can also be rewarding, can it? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. So Jesus ends this segment by encouraging the disciples in this particular moment. But as you walk through chapter 19, there's a couple other things Jesus teaches about. Jesus teaches about children. And by the way, I'll suggest to you that this is a reference to authority as well. Then little children were brought to him. This is my, Matthew 19, 13 through 15, is my favorite interaction with Jesus and the disciples. Not for the negative reasons, but for the positive reasons. Then little children, verse 13, were brought to him that he might put his hands on them and pray, but the disciples rebuked them. Boy, here were some parents who thought, my children need to be in the presence of Jesus. Wasn't that a good thought? That's a brilliant thought. What did the disciples do? They turned him away. Now remember what the disciples just said. If marriage is this hard, let's just not get married. Okay. There's a reason I'm bringing that up twice. It happened in the previous section, chapter 19. It's happening in this segment, in chapter 19. Did the disciples always get it right? Now let's ask this question of ourselves. Do we always get it right? Are we perfect? We would like to be, wouldn't we? We would like to be. And sometimes we perceive ourselves to be. But listen to the question again. Are we perfect? Well, Jesus is going to answer that. But Jesus said, let the little children come to me and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Where is perfection found? Children. Now, I know sometimes children are rambunctious. I know sometimes you have to bring the swift hand of authority to them. I know sometimes there's things that have to be done. I understand that, but look, when you look at children, the kingdom of heaven is on display, and he laid his hands on them and departed from them. And then in this particular occasion, as you walk through what's happening in chapter 19, one came to him and said, good teacher, this is verse 16, what good things shall I do that I may have eternal life? Now here's something I want you to see that's important. In Matthew 19, some come to Jesus, verses 1 through 12, and they try to trick Jesus, but others come to Jesus and they really want to know. Here's an occasion. Master, what should I do to inherit eternal life? What a great question, don't you agree? What do I need to do to be with you in heaven? And Jesus asked some questions of this young man. Jesus asked some questions of him about what he says and what he's done in his life. And this young man, verse 20, says, all these things I have kept from my youth, what do I still lack? I love that question. For the reason of the greatest room in our life is the room for improvement. The greatest room in our life is the room for improvement. I've done all these things. I've kept the law. I've done all the things. Jesus rattles off all these things that this young man needed to do. He says, I've done those from my youth. You know what that tells me? Two things it tells me. Number one, he respected God. Number two, he was taught to respect God. Because a respect of God does not just happen on accident. It doesn't happen overnight. He was taught to respect God. Interestingly enough, we go from children to this young rich ruler, and he respects God. What do I lack? And he says, verse 21 to him, if you want to be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. Now, this is the last thing we're going to read about this young man. Verse 22, when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Don't know what happened to this young man, but he had a decision to make, didn't he? It was either his riches had to be his God, or God was going to be his God. There's an illustration that's before us as we're in this segment. Now, also I've included Jesus as teacher with this last particular segment inside of chapter 20, especially as you follow this particular scene out. Jesus talks about how all things are possible at the end of chapter 19. But chapter 20, Jesus talks about laborers. And verse 1 says, for the kingdom of heaven is like unto a landowner who went out in the early morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. All right? Anybody ever been hired before? Anybody ever agreed for a wage before? Okay, we understand this. Verse 2, now when he had agreed with the laborers and for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard, and he went out about the third hour and saw men standing in the marketplace. Verse 4, he also sent them into the vineyard and told them he'd give them what was right. Verse 5, he went out about the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and did likewise. He found more people that need to go work. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing idly and said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day? Verse 7, they said to him, because no one hired us, he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right you will receive. What's the point of verses 1 through 16? What's the point of these hours, and what's the point of this payment? What is Jesus teaching? We don't study Matthew 20 very often. What is Jesus teaching? Think about it for a minute. I know you got to read the rest of it. I know we end up talking about those who get what is right to them, and Jesus says that's what the landowner was going to give, and that's what he gave to them when the time comes. You know what the signification of this is? Anyone can come to Christ no matter the hour. Whether it's in the first hours of which he calls, whether if you'll follow it down, the 4th hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, the 11th hour, that's getting down to the end of the day. By the way, an 11-hour workday is when some people started to go to work. Think about that for just a minute. They started at the 11th hour. We don't know how long they continued to work, but that's when they started. That means there are some who have been there a long time, and there are some who just got there. But yet all received just payment. You know what that tells me? It tells you the same thing, that anyone can come to Christ. But you look at verse 16, something interesting happens. So the last will be first, and the first last, for as many are called, but few are chosen. In other words, you can come to Christ no matter the time, no matter the hour. Jesus teaches. We need to remember Matthew 20 more, because we need to remember the value of all lives who need to hear the message about Jesus. Now, as you continue on, you see Jesus who has disciples. And Jesus, in this particular occasion, is going to tell the disciples of the third time, here's what's getting ready to happen to me. This is verses 18 and 19 of Matthew chapter 20. He says, behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again. This is the third occasion that Jesus with his disciples, by the way, look at verse 17. He was going to Jerusalem. He took the 12 disciples aside on the road and said to them the same thing he's already told them. But he gives them a little bit more details here. Who he's going to be betrayed into the hands of. What they're going to do to him. They're going to condemn him to death. What they're going to do to him. They're going to mock him. They're going to scourge him. They're going to crucify him. By the way, are any of those things positive? Not a one. But he reminds them of something. It's in the last part of verse 19. What's going to happen on the third day with Jesus? He's going to rise again. Now, I want to ask you a question, and it's a yes or no. There's no other deviations to this answer, okay? Do you believe that he rose again on the third day? You need to answer that question in your life. We need to answer. I've got to answer that question in my life. Because if I'm not following a risen Savior, we've got problems. No, I'm just following a mere mortal. I'm just following a mere man. But Jesus, in this occasion, he spends time with his disciples telling them what's getting ready to happen. And it just so happens as this happens, as they're on their way into Jerusalem, as this continues on, we begin to see a mother's heart. This is from verse 20 down to verse 28. Jesus talks about serving, and then a mother comes to Jesus, and she asks Jesus a question. Now, mamas always want something for their children. What is it? The best. That's what mamas do. That's what mamas are known for. And this particular mama comes and she asks a question of Jesus, just wanted one thing of him. Grant that these two sons of mine, they may sit on your right hand and on the left in your kingdom. Pretty good spot, huh? That's a pretty good spot, right? That's what she asked him to do. But Jesus answered and says, you don't know what you ask. If you're able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, they said to him, we're able. And so he said to them, you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit on my right and my left is not mine to give. By the way, what is that a reference to? Authority. Okay, see that? I know we're referencing the kingdom of heaven. I know we're referencing the idea of greatness and power and all those things. But he says it's not mine to give. Did Jesus believe in authority, divine authority? The answer is yes. It's for those whom it is prepared for by my Father, and the rest heard it. But what happens is verse 24, then the 10 heard it, and they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. Boy, isn't that something? 10 guys are mad at 2 guys because somebody else did something. Doesn't that sound right? 10 guys are mad at 2 guys because they didn't do nothing. Now, did they put their mama up to it? I don't know. Were they pretty excited that she asked? Probably. Probably. But just notice this. Here's 10 guys and here's 2 guys and problems. Problems. And Jesus talks about all these things that happen, and Jesus talks about authority and what Jesus is going to do and how he must go give his life a ransom for many. Now in this idea of disciples, he does something before them and with them, because I want you to see verse 29, and now as they went out of Jericho, great multitudes followed him. As who went out of Jericho? They. That's Jesus, the disciples, and now there's these multitudes. And it just happens, verse 30, there are 2 blind men who were there on the road as Jesus was passing. And they asked this, or said this phrase, have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. Mercy. They just wanted mercy. Now, how many of us in this room have ever been blind? Sort of, I guess. You take your glasses off, you can't see as well. Y'all are, Will, you're real fuzzy. I can see you, but there's almost 2 of you. That's real good. Could you imagine 2 Wills? Put your glasses back on. Ooh, that's better. Same thing for you guys. There were 6 of you in the booth back there. It was getting real odd over there. But our eyesight, how important is our eyesight? That's big. So here's 2 blind men. I don't know what that's like. You don't either. But there were 2 blind men, and here's what they begged of Jesus: have mercy on us. I can hear their hearts. I think you can as well. But I want you to see verse 34. So Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. How hard was it for Jesus to give them their sight? I want you to see the greatness of Jesus. I want you to see Jesus who was teaching. Now, Jesus verbally was not teaching, was he? But what does Jesus teach you and I from verse 34? Jesus teaches us compassion on those that are around us. Now, you and I will never be able to touch the eyes of the blind and that they may receive their sight. But are there not people in our community of whose lives we can touch to help and to alter? Because look at what Jesus did. After he healed them, what did they do? And they followed him. Our goal is to be more like Christ, to live this style life so that others will follow who? Him. This phrase, followed him, comes through the book over and over. Whether Jesus is calling individuals, whether it's multitudes that follow him, or here where others enter into an account with Jesus and they end up following him. So Jesus is on his way out of Galilee. And remember, the multitudes are still following Jesus. So now it's time for Jerusalem. Now, what's going to happen after Jesus enters Jerusalem? The timetable is about to advance. Okay, we have looked at about from chapter 5 now to chapter 21 over 4 weeks. It's taken us a long amount of time, but now our study seemingly is going to slow down, and we're going to walk through time slower because things are moving fast. I mean, things are getting ready to move because Jesus is now where he needed to be. Jesus is now getting ready to be betrayed. Time is moving. Time. That's why he came, remember? That was the purpose of Jesus. And what's interesting, we read inside of Matthew 21, verse 1, "Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples." Something's getting ready to happen, and Jesus is going to send 2 disciples ahead of him. He tells them, verses 2 and 3, to go into the villages opposite of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me, and if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them. Obviously, Jerusalem's really important. Obviously, it's really important to Jesus. Now, something's interesting to me. What has Jesus told the disciples now 3 times that's getting ready to happen? Okay. And yet, did he ever turn his face away from Jerusalem? But he set his face steadfast to go to Jerusalem. Here's the lesson I want us to learn from Matthew 21 today. Sometimes life is hard. I'll say that a second time. Sometimes life is hard. But following God is always valuable. Following God is always valuable. Jesus, who was God, Jesus, who before the foundation of the world was ever laid, before he laid that foundation, by the way, he knew where he was going to go. He's had a lot of time to think about this. And now in that earthly form, now with all these fleshly desires, he's got a lot of things to think about. A lot of problems before Jesus at this very moment. And Jesus sends the men to do as he wills. But I want you to see something, verse 4. It's in Matthew 21, verse 4. All of this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of by the prophet. That is a huge verse that sometimes we just, we don't pay attention to that. Because it's not eye-catching to us. It's not some amazing thing that Jesus did. He didn't just give somebody their sight. He didn't just feed 5,000. He hasn't done these amazing things in this moment. But this is probably one of the most profound passages of the book of Matthew. What was Jesus here to do? The will of the Father. We went through all these statements. The will of him that sent me. We walked through all of those in our study. This is that statement again. He was doing these things that it might be fulfilled of what the prophets said. And you can read down from verse 4 or verse 5 down into verse 9 all these things. But what I want you to see is what happens in verses 10 and 11. Verse 10, and when he had come in Jerusalem, all the city was moved. And listen to what they said. Who is this? Good question. This triumphant entry is happening. Great multitudes are on the roads, verse 8. They've cut down branches from trees. They've spread them on the road. This is an impressive entrance into Jerusalem. Didn't happen every day. By the way, we might say it this way. Someone rolled out the red carpet. Something big is happening. And so people are asking the question, who's that? Who's that guy? And thus, look at verse 11. So the multitude said, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. I want you to signal in on a phrase. Really 2 phrases that are important. The multitudes said. You know what that means? The multitudes knew who this was. Therefore, we've got to be able to answer the question, who is Jesus? But number 2, this is what they said. This is Jesus. That may not sound like an impressive statement as of now, but it might be one of the most impressive entrances into Jerusalem that's ever been taken. So as Jesus is going out of Galilee, he now enters Jerusalem. But here's what I want you to see as we kind of bring our class this morning to a conclusion. Jesus is opposed. It's in Matthew chapter 21, when you read down into verse 12 down to verse 17, that Jesus comes into the temple. Now, I want to preface this segment with one thing. Remember who you are. I'm going to ask one question to help us remember who we are. Who in this room today is Jesus? Which one of us is Jesus? I think that sunk in, hadn't it? There's not a one in this room that's Jesus, correct? I want to make sure we're good. Because Jesus enters the temple and he cleanses the temple. Verse 12, Jesus entered the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple and overturned the tables of money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. In verse 13, he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Who had the authority to turn over the tables? Just remember that. Okay, before you go flipping over tables, remember who you are. Okay, who was Jesus? He was God. Whose house was this? It was his. And it had been turned into something of which it was never designed to be. Do you see the problem of humanity? We managed to turn things into something they were never designed to be. That's what happened here in this particular occasion. And Jesus cleanses the temple. And I want you to see something at the very end, verse 17. He left them and went out of the city of Bethany, and he lodged there. After this was over, he just leaves. Because I believe you and I understand that the chief priests and the signs, and the scribes, when they saw what he had done, that they understood what he had done. And they knew who he was. But you see, as this continues on, there's a curse that takes place. There is a tree. As Jesus turned to the city, he was hungry. Verse 18. Verse 19, he saw a fig tree, but there were no leaves on it. And he, in this scene, as you'll see, he says, "Let no fruit ever grow on you again." And immediately the fig tree withered away. And it was the disciples, verse 20, who were amazed and asked of themselves, "How did this tree wither away so soon?" Who made the command, "Let no figs live on you anymore"? It was Jesus. And then the last segment we're going to look at is in the scenes of verse 33, or really from verse 23 down to the end of the chapter. There was a challenge. Jesus in this scenes is teaching. He's entered the temple. He's teaching. Verse 23. The chief priests and elders of the people confronted him as he was teaching. By the way, you know what that signifies to us? It was as if someone busted in the door while Bible class was happening and halted the class. That's what happened. He was literally in the midst of teaching, and boom, someone comes in, and they ask the question, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" By the way, who gave Jesus his authority? It wasn't man. It was the Father. Then a couple other things to notice. You can see these in chapter 21. Beginning in verse 31, the Son. Beginning in verse 46, there's a parable. But what you have is Jesus who is opposed. And by the way, we know from this point on that Jesus is going to walk into problem after problem after problem. Well, that's where we're going to end today. Our time has ceased on us. We will pick up next week looking at the continuation of what takes place with Jesus as we march through the remaining chapters of the book of Matthew. Thank you so much.